The night air felt cool against Diane Walker's face as she stepped out of the community center. She paused to say goodbye to the event organizers, her smile bright despite the exhaustion that tugged at her. The fundraiser had been a success. They'd raised almost double their goal for the children's after-school program. As the director of community outreach at her foundation, nights like these made the long hours worth it. "You sure you don't need a ride home, Diane?" asked Robert, the center's administrator, his keys jingling in his hand. "I'm fine, really," Diane replied, gesturing to her car parked across the street. "It's just a 15-minute drive. Besides, I need to clear my head a bit before bed." Robert nodded, giving her a friendly wave before heading toward his own vehicle. Diane checked her watch, 11:45 p.m. Later than she'd planned to stay, but the passionate discussions about expanding their youth programs had kept everyone energized well past the scheduled end time. She settled into her car, a modest sedan that she'd owned for nearly 5 years. The folder containing donor information and program proposals sat neatly on the passenger seat beside her designer purse, a splurge she'd allowed herself after her recent promotion. Diane adjusted her blazer and started the engine, mentally reviewing tomorrow's meetings as she pulled away from the curb. The streets were mostly empty at this hour, streetlights casting pools of yellow light on the clean sidewalks of Oakwood Heights. This wasn't her neighborhood. Her apartment was across town, but she'd driven this route dozens of times for work. The fundraiser had been held at the community center here because it was centrally located and many of their wealthiest donors lived nearby. Diane was approaching an intersection when she noticed the flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her brow furrowed as she checked her speedometer. She'd been driving just under the limit. Perhaps a taillight was out. She signaled and pulled to the side of the road, hands already reaching for her registration in the glove compartment. 2 officers approached her car, one on each side. The taller one, a white man with a crew cut who appeared to be in his 40s, shined his flashlight directly into her face. The beam was unnecessarily bright, making her squint and turn away slightly. "License and registration," he said, his tone clipped and cold. "Of course." "Officer," Diane replied calmly, handing over her documents. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" The officer, his nameplate read Officer Wilson, ignored her question. His partner, a younger man with a rigid posture, circled to the passenger side window and peered in, his flashlight scanning across the interior of her car. "What are you doing in this neighborhood at this hour?" Officer Wilson asked, his eyes narrowing as he examined her license. Diane took a slow breath before answering. She'd been in situations like this before. Questions that wouldn't be asked of others, suspicion that seemed to come from nowhere. "I'm heading home from a fundraising event at the Oakwood Heights Community Center. I work for the Bright Futures Foundation." The second officer's light lingered on the folder on her passenger seat. "And what's that?" "Those are materials from tonight's event. Donor information, program outlines. I'm the Director of Community Outreach." Officer Wilson made a sound that might have been a scoff. "Pretty late for a charity event, don't you think?" It ran longer than expected. "We had a good turnout," Diane explained, maintaining her professional tone despite the growing discomfort in her stomach. She'd worn her best suit for the event, navy blue with a cream blouse, her hair styled in a neat bun, pearl earrings catching the light. She looked every bit the professional she was, yet the officer's expression suggested they saw something else entirely. "Step out of the vehicle, please," Wilson said suddenly. Diane blinked in surprise. "Officer, I don't understand. I haven't done anything wrong. Could you please tell me why I was pulled over?" "Step out of the vehicle now," he repeated, his hand moving to rest on his holster, a subtle gesture that sent a chill through Diane. With careful movements, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. The night had grown colder, or perhaps it was just the situation that made her shiver slightly as she stood on the empty street. A few lights had come on in nearby houses, residents curious about the police lights outside their windows. "Put your hands on the hood," instructed the younger officer, whose nameplate read Officer Brooks. "Is this really necessary?" Diane asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I was just driving home from work." "Work, huh?" Wilson said, looking her up and down. "In this neighborhood?" The implication was clear in his tone, in the way his eyes lingered skeptically on her professional attire, as if she were wearing a costume rather than clothes that belonged to her. "Yes, work," Diane affirmed. As I mentioned, I'm the Director of Community Outreach at the Bright Futures Foundation. We held a fundraiser tonight for our children's programs. Wilson exchanged a glance with Brooks. We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. People who don't belong here scoping out houses. A flush of indignation warmed Diane's cheeks despite the cool air. I assure you, I wasn't scoping out anything. I was at a charity event with dozens of witnesses, including the mayor's assistant. Neither officer seemed impressed by this information. Brooks moved toward her car. Mind if we take a look inside? Actually, I do mind, Diane said, straightening her posture. Do you have probable cause for searching my vehicle? I've told you why I'm in the area, and I've provided my identification. I'd like to know specifically why I was pulled over. Wilson's expression hardened. You seem pretty defensive for someone who's done nothing wrong. I'm not being defensive, officer. I'm asking for the same respect and procedure that should be afforded to any citizen. Diane kept her voice level, though she was acutely aware of how quickly situations like this could escalate. A light drizzle began to fall, speckling Diane's blazer with tiny droplets. Neither officer suggested moving to a more sheltered location. Brooks had already begun looking through her car windows more intently. What's in the folder? He asked, pointing to the materials on her passenger seat. As I said, it contains information from tonight's fundraiser. Donor lists, program proposals, budget outlines. Looks like a lot of personal information, Brooks remarked, his implication hanging in the air. Diane felt a flicker of anger but kept it from her voice. Because it is. That's why I'm taking it back to our office for proper filing. Wilson was still holding her license and registration, making a show of examining them closely. This address isn't anywhere near here. You're quite a ways from home. The community center isn't in my neighborhood, no. Our foundation serves children across the city, and the center was chosen as a central location for our donors. More lights had come on in nearby houses. An elderly man in a bathrobe stood at his front window watching. A younger couple had emerged onto their porch across the street, the woman holding a phone in her hand. The rain fell more steadily now. Diane's carefully styled hair began to dampen and her blazer was becoming soaked. Still, she maintained her composure, even as Officer Wilson radioed in her information, speaking in a low voice that she couldn't quite make out. You mind opening your trunk? Brooks asked, though it sounded more like a command than a question. I do mind, actually, Diane replied. Unless you have a warrant or specific reason to search my vehicle, I don't consent to a search. Wilson stepped closer, his presence intimidating. Listen, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. We're just doing our job, making sure everything is as it should be. And I'm just exercising my rights as a citizen, Diane countered, feeling her heart pound harder in her chest. She was aware of how these encounters could spiral, how standing her ground might be seen as defiance rather than dignity. The radio on Wilson's shoulder crackled. He turned slightly away to respond, his eyes never leaving Diane. The rain continued to fall, heavier now, plastering Diane's blouse to her skin. She resisted the urge to cross her arms or show any sign that might be interpreted as hostile. Your car matches the description of a vehicle seen leaving a burglary last week, Wilson finally said, though something in his tone suggested this was information he'd just invented. That's impossible, Diane replied. I was giving a presentation at the university last week. My car was in the faculty parking lot all evening. There would be security footage. A look passed between the officers, frustration perhaps at her calm responses and clear alibis. Brooks opened his mouth to say something else when a voice called from across the street. Is everything okay over there? It was the man from the porch, standing at the edge of his property, phone still visible in his wife's hand. Please return to your home, sir, Wilson called back. Police business, but the man didn't move. I've been recording since you pulled her over, the woman beside him called. Just so everyone feels safe. Diane felt a complex mix of emotions, gratitude for the witnesses, fear of how the officers might react to being recorded, and the exhaustion of having to maintain perfect composure throughout this encounter. Wilson turned back to Diane, his demeanor slightly altered by the knowledge they were being watched and recorded. Wait here, he said, walking back to the patrol car with her license and registration. Brooks remained near her, his posture stiff. The rain had soaked through his uniform cap, drops running down his face. For a moment, Diane almost felt sorry for him, standing in the rain on what was surely a routine patrol that had somehow turned into this strange standoff. More neighbors had appeared at windows and on porches. A car slowed as it passed, the driver clearly curious about the scene. Diane remained still, rain running down her face, her professional appearance slowly being undone by the weather and the stress of the situation. After what felt like an eternity but was probably just a few minutes, Wilson returned, holding her documents. His expression had changed again, a slight uncertainty now visible in his features. "You're free to go, Ms. Walker," he said, handing back her license and registration. Diane accepted them without comment, waiting for an explanation that didn't come. "Next time, make sure both your taillights are working properly," Wilson added. Though Diane knew with absolute certainty that both her taillights were functioning perfectly, she'd had her car serviced just last week. "Of course, officer," she replied evenly. "Thank you for your concern." As she turned to get back in her car, dignity intact despite her drenched clothing and the indignity of the encounter, Diane noticed that several of the neighbors were still watching, still recording. The couple across the street nodded to her in silent solidarity. Diane slid back into her car, placed her soaked blazer on the back seat, and took a moment to collect herself before starting the engine. Her hands trembled slightly, the only outward sign of the storm of emotions within her. As she pulled away from the curb, she glanced in her rearview mirror. The officers stood watching her leave, their postures rigid under the glow of the streetlight. She drove exactly at the speed limit, both hands on the wheel, all the way to the main road before finally allowing herself a deep, shaking breath. Tomorrow she would file a formal complaint. Tomorrow she would speak to her contacts about this incident. But tonight she just wanted to get home, to change out of her wet clothes, and to remind herself that no matter how they had treated her, she knew exactly who she was. Diane's relief at being allowed to leave lasted exactly 3 blocks. The flash of police lights appeared in her mirror once again and her stomach dropped. She pulled over immediately, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel where they would be visible. The same patrol car stopped behind her, and officers Wilson and Brooks approached her vehicle with purposeful strides. This time, Wilson didn't even bother with a greeting. "Step out of the vehicle, Ms. Walker," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Officer, may I ask why I'm being pulled over again?" Diane kept her voice steady despite the anxiety building in her chest. "You just checked my license and registration. We have reason to believe you may be transporting illegal materials," Brooks said from the passenger side. "Exit the vehicle now." Diane's mind raced. Illegal materials? The only things in her car were her purse, the fundraiser documents, and maybe a gym bag in the trunk. Nevertheless, she knew better than to argue. Carefully, she opened her door and stepped out into the rain, which had intensified into a proper downpour. "Is there somewhere we could continue this conversation out of the rain?" she asked, already feeling water seeping through her clothes again. Her hair, which she had quickly tried to fix after the first stop, was now completely soaked. "This won't take long if you cooperate," Wilson replied, ignoring her request. "Place your hands on the hood of your car and spread your legs." The humiliation burned hot in Diane's chest as she complied, aware that they were now on a more populated street. A bus shelter about 50 feet away held 3 people who were openly staring. A man walking his dog had stopped to watch. Cars slowed as they passed. "This is completely unnecessary," Diane said quietly as Wilson began to pat her down. "We'll be the judge of what's necessary," he replied, his hands moving over her blazer pockets with what felt like deliberate slowness. Brooks had already begun searching her car, pulling open the glove compartment and rifling through the papers inside. "You have a lot of addresses written down here," he called out, holding up a notebook that Diane recognized as her contact list for work. "Those are the addresses of community centers and schools where we run our youth programs," she explained, still bent over the hood of her car. The cold metal against her palms was a stark contrast to the burning shame she felt. "As I told you before, I work for a nonprofit foundation." Wilson finished his pat-down and stood beside her. "You can stand up, but don't move away from the vehicle." Diane straightened, trying to maintain her dignity despite her soaking wet clothes clinging to her body and her makeup likely running down her face. She noticed a woman in a nearby apartment building taking a video with her phone through the window. Small comforts. "What foundation did you say you worked for again?" Wilson asked, his tone suggesting he didn't believe her. "The Bright Futures Foundation. We provide after-school programs and educational support for underserved children across the city. Diane reached slowly toward her purse, which Brooks had placed on the roof of her car. I have my business card. Don't move, Wilson barked, his hand moving to his holster again. Diane froze, her heart pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it. I was just reaching for my business card, she said quietly. We'll take a look, Brooks said, grabbing her purse himself. He began pulling items out and placing them on the roof of her car. Her wallet, phone, keys, lipstick, a pack of tissues, her business card holder. The rain continued to pour, soaking everything they placed on the car. Diane watched as water seeped into her leather wallet, as her phone screen collected droplets, as her business cards began to warp in their holder. Officer, please, those items are getting ruined, she said, unable to keep the distress from her voice. Could you at least put them back in my purse? Brooks ignored her, opening her wallet and examining her credit cards, library card, gym membership, and the small photo she kept of her late father. He held up the business cards, now soggy from the rain. Bright Futures Foundation, he read aloud. Director of Community Outreach, Diane Walker. Something in his tone had changed slightly, but Wilson seemed unaffected. He was now examining the folder from the passenger seat, flipping through the damp pages with a skeptical expression. These donor lists, he said. Pretty fancy names on here. You expect us to believe all these rich folks just handed their information over to you? The insinuation stung, but Diane had dealt with this kind of prejudice before. Yes, Officer Wilson, because that's exactly what happened. We held a fundraiser tonight with over 60 attendees. The mayor's office sent a representative. Councilwoman Patterson was there herself. You're welcome to call any of them to verify. Wilson's eyes narrowed at her confidence, at the casual dropping of influential names. Brooks continued searching through her car, opening the center console, checking under the seats, even pulling up the floor mats. A small crowd had gathered now, despite the rain. At least 7 or 8 people stood watching from under umbrellas or the shelter of the bus stop. 2 cars had pulled to the side of the road, their occupants observing the scene. Diane felt exposed on display like an exhibit of humiliation. You mind opening your trunk? Wilson asked, though it wasn't really a question. This time, knowing refusal would only prolong the encounter, Diane nodded. The release is by the driver's seat, she said. Brooks pulled the lever and the trunk popped open. Wilson moved to look inside, shining his flashlight over her gym bag. A folded blanket, a small toolkit, and a box of children's books she'd been meaning to donate to one of their program sites. What are these for? Wilson asked, pointing to the books. They're children's books for our reading program, Diane explained, fighting to keep her voice from shaking. We encourage literacy through... Pretty expensive way to move books around, Wilson interrupted, picking up a hardcover copy of The Lion, the Witch, and The Wardrobe that had been donated by a local bookstore. Brand new books in a fancy car. Some are new donations, yes. Others are gently used, Diane said. And my car is a 5-year-old sedan, hardly what most would consider fancy. Wilson's jaw tightened at her response. He began opening her gym bag, pulling out her workout clothes, her sneakers, even checking the pockets of her shorts. One of the onlookers, an older man with gray hair under an umbrella, stepped closer. Is there a problem here, officers? He called out. Sir, please stay back, Brooks responded immediately. Police business. Seems like harassment to me, the man replied. But he didn't approach further. Wilson zipped the gym bag closed and dropped it back into the trunk with less care than Diane would have liked. Everything looks clear here, he said to Brooks, though his tone suggested disappointment rather than relief. Brooks nodded, still holding Diane's now soaked wallet and phone. He handed them back to her without a word about their condition. So am I free to go now? Diane asked, gathering her belongings and trying to dry her phone on a relatively dry patch of her blouse. Not quite yet, Wilson replied. We still need to run your plates. You already did that during the first stop, Diane pointed out, unable to keep a note of frustration from her voice. We need to be thorough, Wilson said, walking back to the patrol car. Diane stood in the rain holding her wet purse and ruined business cards, aware of the eyes of strangers on her. She felt stripped not just of privacy but of dignity, yet she maintained her composure, knowing that showing anger would only make the situation worse. A young woman approached from the bus shelter, holding out a small package of tissues. Here, she said quietly. For your things? Diane accepted them with a grateful nod, using them to dab at her phone and wallet. The small kindness from a stranger nearly brought tears to her eyes, but she blinked them back. After what felt like an eternity, Wilson returned from the patrol car, his expression unreadable. Your vehicle comes back clean, he said, as if this was surprising information. Yes, I'm aware, Diane replied, unable to keep a hint of dryness from her tone. As I mentioned earlier, I've done nothing wrong. Wilson's eyes narrowed slightly. You match a description we received of a suspicious person in the area. We were just doing our job. Diane knew there had been no such description, but arguing would only prolong the encounter. I understand, she said. May I go now? Yes, you can go, Brooks said, closing her car door with unnecessary force. Drive safely. And make sure you use your turn signals properly, Wilson added. Though Diane had used her signals correctly at every turn, she nodded and carefully got back into her car, placing her wet belongings on the passenger seat beside the fundraiser folder, which Brooks had carelessly left open, several pages now stuck together from the rain. She started the engine and pulled away slowly, acutely aware of the officers watching her and the small crowd of witnesses dispersing. 2 blocks away, Diane pulled into the parking lot of a closed convenience store and turned off the engine. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against the steering wheel, and finally allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. Her shoulders shook as she took deep, steadying breaths, fighting back tears of frustration and indignation. After a few minutes, she sat up straight and checked her phone, relieved to find it still working despite the water damage. With slightly trembling fingers, she opened her contacts and scrolled to a familiar name. Anthony Richardson, her friend who worked as a civil rights attorney. She hesitated for just a moment before pressing the call button. Anthony, it's Diane, she said when he answered, her voice now betraying her emotion. Something happened tonight that I need to talk to you about. She paused, listening to his concerned response. No, I'm okay. Physically, at least. But I was just stopped by police twice, and I need to understand what my options are. As she recounted the events to her friend, Diane looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror, her usually neat hair now plastered to her head, mascara smudged under her eyes, her professional appearance in disarray. But what she saw beyond the surface was her own unwavering strength. They had tried to strip her of her dignity, but they had failed. They had treated her as less than she was, but they couldn't change who she was. Yes, she said into the phone, her resolve strengthening. I want to file a formal complaint first thing tomorrow. This can't keep happening to people. Not to me, not to anyone. The rain continued to fall, drumming on the roof of her car, but Diane Walker had weathered the storm. What she didn't know yet was that the officers who had just humiliated her were about to face a storm of their own. One, entirely of their making. Anthony Richardson listened patiently as Diane recounted the details of her encounter with the police officers. Though she couldn't see him, she could picture his expression, brows furrowed, jaw tight with controlled anger. They'd been friends since law school, before she'd chosen nonprofit work and he'd gone into civil rights law. Are you sure you don't want me to come get you? He asked, concern evident in his voice. You shouldn't be driving if you're upset. I'm okay now, Diane assured him, though her hands still trembled slightly. I just needed to tell someone what happened. Document everything while it's fresh, Anthony advised. Take photos of your wet belongings. Write down their badge numbers, the patrol car number, everything you can remember. I'll meet you at the station tomorrow at 8 a.m. to file the complaint. After ending the call, Diane followed his advice, using her phone to photograph her damp wallet, the water-damaged documents, and even her own disheveled appearance. Evidence, Anthony had called it. The word made her stomach clench. That she needed evidence of her own mistreatment felt like another layer of indignity. The clock on her dashboard read 12:40 a.m. when she finally pulled back onto the road. Her apartment was only 10 minutes away now, and the thought of a hot shower and dry clothes was the only thing keeping her going. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but occasional headlights from passing cars still caught the water on her windshield, creating momentary prisms of light. Diane was so focused on getting home that she almost didn't notice the patrol car that pulled into traffic several vehicles behind her. Almost. A glance in her rearview mirror confirmed her fear. It was the same car. Wilson and Brooks were following her again. You've got to be kidding me, she whispered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. She considered calling Anthony back but decided against it. If they pulled her over again, she'd handle it the same way, with dignity and restraint. Even though her patience was wearing dangerously thin, the patrol car maintained its distance for several blocks, neither closing the gap nor falling behind. It was a game, Diane realized, a way to let her know they were watching, to keep the pressure on. Her nerves frayed with each passing minute. When the turn signal for her apartment complex came into view, Diane felt a surge of relief. She signaled carefully, hyper-aware of her driving now. As she turned into the complex, the patrol car drove past, continuing down the main road. Diane exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving her body. At least they weren't going to harass her at her own home. She parked in her assigned spot and gathered her belongings, noticing with dismay that her wallet had already begun to show water damage on the leather. Another expense she'd have to bear because of tonight's events. She was so tired now, the adrenaline of the encounters finally wearing off and leaving her drained. The light in the security booth was on as she walked toward her building, and Diane made a point to wave to Joe, the night guard. He was an older man, retired from construction, who took the night shifts to supplement his pension. "Working late, Ms. Walker?" he called, stepping out of the booth. "Fundraiser ran long," she explained, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Joe's expression shifted to concern. "You're soaking wet. Everything okay?" Diane hesitated, then decided there was no point hiding it. "Got pulled over. Twice, actually. Officers made me stand in the rain while they searched my car." Joe's friendly demeanor hardened. "They had a warrant?" "No," Diane replied. "Just a lot of questions about what someone like me was doing in that neighborhood." Understanding passed between them, the unspoken recognition of a shared experience, despite their different ages and backgrounds. "Want me to walk you up?" Joe offered. "I'll be fine, but thank you," Diane said, touched by his concern. "I'm filing a complaint in the morning." Joe nodded approvingly. "Good. You know, with your position and all, this could really shake things up." "That's what I'm hoping," Diane replied, bidding him good night before heading to the elevator. Inside her apartment, Diane peeled off her wet clothes and stepped into a hot shower, letting the water wash away the physical discomfort of the night, if not the emotional weight. As she dressed in dry clothes and made herself a cup of tea, her phone buzzed with a text from Anthony. "Just heard from a contact at the department. Your stop made the radio chatter. Officers called in your info for an extensive background check. Things might get interesting tomorrow." Diane stared at the message, unsure what to make of it. She was too exhausted to puzzle it out now. After setting her alarm for early morning, she finally crawled into bed, though sleep proved elusive as her mind replayed the events of the night. Officer Wilson slouched in the chair at his desk, filling out the paperwork for the traffic stops. It was nearly the end of their shift, and the station was quiet except for the occasional ring of a phone or the hum of conversation from the dispatch area. "You really think she was up to something?" Brooks asked, leaning against the desk. The younger officer had been unusually quiet during the drive back to the station. "People like that don't just drive around those neighborhoods at midnight for no reason," Wilson replied without looking up. She was too polished, too rehearsed with her answers. "She did have those business cards, though," Brooks pointed out. "And the donor list looked legit." Wilson shot him a look. "Since when did you become so trusting? Run a proper check on her if you're so curious. I'm finishing this report." Brooks hesitated, then moved to a nearby computer terminal. He typed in Diane Walker's name and driver's license number, then added a deeper background search parameter that was typically reserved for suspects in ongoing investigations. It was procedurally questionable, but his curiosity had gotten the better of him. The first results were standard: clean driving record, no criminal history, current address matching her license, employment history showing 7 years at the Bright Futures Foundation, with a recent promotion to Director of Community Outreach. Nothing surprising there. Then Brooks clicked on the extended profile that the system had generated, and his expression changed from casual interest to shock. He read the screen again, making sure he hadn't misunderstood. "Wilson," he said, his voice tight. "You need to see this." "What now?" Wilson grumbled, pushing back from his desk and walking over. "Did our community leader turn out to have a—" His words died as he looked at the screen. Diane Walker wasn't just any community outreach director. According to her profile, She was the newly appointed liaison to the Police Community Relations Board, a civilian oversight committee that reviewed police conduct and policies. Not only that, but she had been instrumental in designing the department's recent bias training program, the very one both officers had been required to complete 3 months ago. But it was the note at the bottom of the profile that made Wilson's face drain of color. Subject is sister of Deputy Mayor Thomas Walker and founder of the Children's Medical Support Initiative, which provided critical funding for life-saving treatment of Officer James Wilson's daughter, leukemia treatment, 2021, when insurance denied coverage. Wilson stared at the screen, unable to process what he was seeing. The woman he had forced to stand in the rain, whose car he had searched without cause, whose belongings he had carelessly allowed to get soaked. That woman had created the program that his daughter's doctors had praised as life-saving when Katie was diagnosed with leukemia. The foundation had covered nearly $200,000 in treatment costs when his insurance company had denied the experimental therapy that ultimately put his daughter in remission. This can't be right, he muttered, though he knew it was. He remembered signing the forms, remembered the foundation's name on the hospital paperwork, remembered his overwhelming gratitude to the faceless organization that had saved his child when he'd been drowning in despair and medical bills. Brooks was scrolling through more information now. It gets worse, he said quietly. There are at least 7 videos of our stops already circulating on social media. 3 neighbors sent footage to the local news, and she's scheduled to meet with the chief tomorrow morning about expanding the bias training program to include more real-world scenarios. Wilson sank into the chair beside the terminal, the full weight of what they'd done hitting him like a physical blow. They hadn't just harassed a random black woman in an affluent neighborhood. They'd targeted, intimidated, and humiliated someone who was not only connected to the highest levels of city government, but who had personally, if unknowingly, saved his daughter's life. "We need to talk to the lieutenant," Brooks said, his earlier cockiness replaced by genuine concern. "Get ahead of this before what?" came a voice from behind them. Lieutenant Rivera stood in the doorway, her expression stone cold. "Before I find out 2 of my officers conducted multiple unlawful stops and searches of the Police Relations Board's newest member. Before the deputy mayor calls demanding to know why his sister was treated like a criminal, or before the videos showing officers Wilson and Brooks violating at least 6 departmental policies go viral." Wilson couldn't meet her eyes. "Lieutenant, we didn't know who she was." "That's exactly the problem," Rivera replied, her voice like ice. "You shouldn't have treated anyone that way, regardless of who they were. But the fact that you did this to Diane Walker of all people..." She shook her head. "Both of you, my office now." As Wilson stood to follow the lieutenant, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his wife. "Did something happen at work? Katie's doctor just called to confirm we're still coming to the foundation fundraiser tomorrow. Said they saw Diane Walker on the news and wanted to make sure we were okay." "What's going on?" Wilson stared at the message, a cold realization washing over him. Tomorrow was the 3-year anniversary celebration of Katie's remission. The fundraiser they had been invited to as special guests was being hosted by the Bright Futures Foundation, by Diane Walker herself. He looked up to see Brooks watching him, the younger officer's face now showing something Wilson had never seen there before. Shame. "She knew," Brooks said quietly. "When you ran her information the second time, she must have seen your name on the computer screen in the patrol car. She knew exactly who you were, who your daughter was, and she still didn't say anything." The full impact of those words hit Wilson like a physical blow. Even after everything they had put her through, Diane Walker had chosen not to use that knowledge against him. She hadn't thrown his daughter's illness in his face or reminded him of his debt to her foundation. She had maintained her dignity while he had abandoned his. "Officer Wilson." "Officer Brooks!" Lieutenant Rivera called sharply from her office doorway. "Now!" As they walked toward what would undoubtedly be the most difficult conversation of their careers, Wilson felt something inside him crack open, the hard shell of prejudice and defensiveness that had built up over years on the force. For the first time, he saw his actions through someone else's eyes, and the view was devastating. The meeting in Lieutenant Rivera's office lasted until nearly 3 a.m. Officer Wilson sat rigid in his chair as the lieutenant played video after video from social media, each showing different angles of their stops and searches of Diane Walker. Seeing their actions from the perspective of bystanders was jarring. The unnecessary flashlights in her face, the prolonged questioning in the rain, the careless handling of her belongings. The department has already received 17 formal complaints from witnesses, Rivera said, closing the laptop. News outlets are requesting statements. The mayor's office called 20 minutes ago. She leveled a hard stare at both officers. What exactly were you thinking? Brooks spoke first, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. We received a call about suspicious activity in the area. Stop, Rivera interrupted. I checked the logs. There was no such call tonight. Not for that neighborhood, not for anywhere in your patrol zone. Wilson stared at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. You both completed bias training just 3 months ago, Rivera continued. Training that Ms. Walker herself helped design. Training that specifically addressed stopping vehicles without cause, making assumptions based on race, and escalating routine encounters. We didn't know who she was, Wilson repeated, the defense sounding hollow even to his own ears. That's the 3rd time you've said that, Rivera noted, and it's the most damning thing you could possibly say. You're admitting that you only treat people with dignity if you think they're important. She shook her head in disgust. Both of you are suspended, effective immediately. Turn in your badges and weapons, Wilson's head snapped up. Lieutenant, please. I have a family to support. My daughter's medical bills. Should have thought about that before you decided to harass the very person whose foundation paid those bills. Rivera cut in. You're both lucky I'm not firing you outright. The complaint hearing is scheduled for 9 a.m. Ms. Walker and her attorney will be present, as will the deputy mayor and Chief Thompson. The reality of the situation crashed down on Wilson's shoulders. His career, the job he'd built over 15 years, was hanging by a thread. All because he and Brooks had seen a well-dressed black woman in an affluent neighborhood and decided she didn't belong there. What do we do? Brooks asked, looking lost and considerably younger than his 28 years. You show up at that hearing prepared to take full responsibility, Rivera advised. No excuses, no, we didn't know who she was. You acknowledge what you did, why it was wrong, and how you plan to do better. Maybe, and this is a big maybe, Ms. Walker will be merciful. She stood, indicating the meeting was over. Now get out of my office. The walk to their lockers was silent, the weight of shame and fear pressing down on both men. As Wilson opened his locker, a photo of his daughter Katie stared back at him, smiling, healthy, alive. The photo had been taken at her last birthday party, 8 months after her final treatment. She was holding a sign that read, "Cancer-free for 2 years," in rainbow letters. My kid would be dead if not for her foundation, Wilson said quietly, almost to himself. Brooks paused in the act of removing his badge. You never mentioned your daughter was sick. Leukemia. Diagnosed 3 years ago. Wilson's voice was hollow as he unclipped his badge. Insurance wouldn't cover the experimental treatment she needed. Said it was unproven. The foundation stepped in, paid for everything. And tonight we... Brooks couldn't finish the sentence. Yeah. Wilson placed his badge and gun in the tray Rivera had provided. Tonight we harassed and humiliated the woman who saved my daughter's life. Diane's alarm went off at 6 a.m. She'd barely slept, managing perhaps 2 hours of restless dozing before giving up entirely. She had spent most of the night documenting everything she could remember about the encounters. Preparing herself for the complaint process that lay ahead, she brewed coffee and checked her phone, which had been buzzing consistently since 5 a.m. with notifications. 3 voicemails from her brother Thomas, the deputy mayor, 5 missed calls from her boss at the foundation, dozens of text messages from friends and colleagues, and an email from Police Chief Thompson himself, expressing deep concern about the incident and offering to move the scheduled bias training discussion to another day if she preferred. Diane sighed, overwhelmed by the attention. All she had wanted was to drive home from a fundraiser. Instead, she'd become the center of a storm that was rapidly expanding beyond her control. She called her brother first, knowing he would be worried sick. Why didn't you call me last night? Thomas demanded as soon as he answered. I had to find out from social media that my sister was harassed by police. It was late and I knew you'd overreact, Diane replied calmly. I handled it. I'm filing the complaint this morning with Anthony. I've already spoken to the chief, Thomas said. Those officers are finished. The videos are damning, Diane. Absolutely damning. I don't want them fired, Diane said, surprising herself with the realization that it was true. I want them to learn from this. I want them to change. Thomas was silent for a moment. You're a better person than I am, he finally said. After seeing how they treated you, it wasn't about me, Diane insisted. It's about a system that taught them to see me as a threat rather than a person. Firing them doesn't fix that system. After promising to meet her brother at the station, Diane called her boss to assure him she was okay, then texted Anthony to confirm he was still meeting her at 8 a.m. She dressed carefully in a crisp navy suit, different from the one that had been ruined the night before, and applied her makeup with precision, armoring herself for the day ahead. Joe, the security guard, was waiting when she left her building. Saw the videos online, he said gravely. You okay? I'm fine, Diane assured him. Just another day fighting the same old battles. Joe shook his head. Not the same. Those officers messed with the wrong woman this time. The police station was buzzing with unusual activity when Anthony and Diane arrived at 8:15 a.m. Officers stopped their conversations to watch as she walked through the lobby, some averting their eyes, others nodding respectfully. Chief Thompson himself came out to meet them. His handshake firm, his expression grave. Ms. Walker, I want to personally apologize for what happened last night, he began. Save it for the hearing, Chief, Anthony interrupted smoothly. My client has prepared a statement. They were shown to a conference room where Lieutenant Rivera was already waiting. Thomas arrived minutes later, his presence as deputy mayor adding an extra layer of tension to the proceedings. At precisely 8:55 a.m., officers Wilson and Brooks were escorted in. Diane's first thought was how different they looked from the night before. Gone was the arrogance, the casual cruelty. Wilson seemed to have aged overnight, deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. Brooks couldn't meet her gaze at all, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. Before we begin, Chief Thompson said, Officers Wilson and Brooks have asked to make statements. Diane nodded her permission, though Anthony looked displeased at the deviation from procedure. Brooks went first, his voice shaky. Ms. Walker, there's no excuse for how we treated you last night. I was wrong. We were wrong. I violated your rights and my oath to protect and serve. I'm deeply ashamed of my actions, and I accept whatever consequences come from this hearing. His apology seemed genuine, the words clearly his own rather than something crafted by a union rep. Diane acknowledged him with a slight nod but remained silent. When Wilson stood, Diane was struck by the change in his demeanor. The confident, intimidating officer from the night before was gone. In his place stood a man who looked utterly broken. Ms. Walker, he began, his voice cracking. I don't deserve your forgiveness. What I did to you was inexcusable. He paused, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. But what makes it even worse is that 3 years ago, your foundation saved my daughter's life. A murmur ran through the room. This was clearly news to everyone except Diane and the two officers. Katie had leukemia, Wilson continued, tears now flowing freely down his face. The insurance company refused to cover the treatment she needed. Your foundation stepped in, paid for everything. She's alive today because of you. He pulled out his phone with trembling hands and showed a photo of a smiling young girl. This is Katie now. Cancer-free for 3 years, thanks to you. His voice broke completely. And last night I treated you like a criminal. I made you stand in the rain. I violated your rights. I can't even begin to express my shame. Wilson wiped at his tears, not caring who saw them. I don't deserve to wear the badge. I've dishonored everything it stands for. But before you make your decision, I need you to know that I'm sorry. Not because you're the deputy mayor's sister. Not because you're on the police relations board. But because you're a human being who deserved to be treated with dignity, and I failed to do that. The room fell silent. Anthony leaned over to whisper something to Diane, but she raised a hand to stop him. She studied Wilson's face for a long moment, seeing the genuine remorse there, the crushing weight of his own actions. Officer Wilson, she finally said, her voice calm and measured. I knew who you were last night. I recognized your name when you ran my information the second time. I saw it on the computer screen in your patrol car. Wilson looked stricken, fresh tears flowing. You knew and you still didn't say anything? Would it have changed how you treated me if I had mentioned your daughter? Diane asked. If I had reminded you that my foundation paid for Katie's treatment? Would that have been what it took for you to see me as a person worthy of respect? Wilson had no answer, his shame written plainly on his face. That's the problem, Diane continued quietly. No one should have to prove their worth to be treated with basic human dignity. No one should have to establish their connections or credentials or importance to avoid harassment. The fact that you needed to know who I was before you would treat me with respect is exactly why we're all sitting here today. She looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes in turn. This isn't just about last night. It's about every person who doesn't have a brother in the mayor's office. Every person who doesn't run a foundation. Every person who can't file a complaint that gets immediate attention. What happens to them when they're pulled over for driving while black? The silence that followed her words was profound, heavy with uncomfortable truth. No one in the conference room spoke for several long moments after Diane's words. The truth of what she'd said, that her connections were the only reason this incident was being addressed so quickly, hung in the air like a weight. Chief Thompson was the first to break the silence. Ms. Walker is right, he said, his voice solemn. And that's why what happens in this room today needs to be about more than just these two officers. Diane nodded, grateful that at least someone understood. This is precisely why I helped design the bias training program in the first place, she said. Because these incidents aren't isolated. They're part of a pattern that affects thousands of people who don't have the privilege of being heard. She turned to face Wilson and Brooks directly. I don't want your badges, she said. Firing you doesn't solve the larger problem. It just makes everyone in this room feel like they've done something. Anthony shifted uncomfortably beside her, clearly surprised by her approach. Thomas, too, looked like he wanted to object but respected his sister enough to remain silent. What do you want, then? Lieutenant Rivera asked. Diane took a deep breath. I want change. Real change. Not just for me, but for everyone who looks like me. She pulled out a folder from her briefcase, a different one from the water-damaged documents from the night before. This is a proposal I was planning to present at our scheduled meeting today, Chief. It outlines an expanded community engagement program that would pair officers with the neighborhoods they patrol. She slid the folder across the table. Officers would spend time in community centers, local businesses, schools, not as authorities, but as participants. They'd get to know the people they're meant to protect, understand their concerns, see them as human beings with lives and families and dreams. Chief Thompson opened the folder, scanning the contents with interest. This is quite comprehensive. I've been working on it for months, Diane said. And now I'd like to add something to it. She looked directly at Wilson and Brooks. I want these officers to be the first participants, not as punishment, but as an opportunity for growth, to learn what they failed to see last night, that communities aren't statistics or stereotypes, they're people. Wilson looked up, surprise cutting through his shame. You'd still trust us to be part of your program, after what we did? This isn't about trust, Diane clarified. It's about transformation. What happened last night was terrible, but it can either be the end of something or the beginning of something. That choice is yours. Brooks nodded slowly. I'd like the chance to do better. Wilson wiped his face with a handkerchief, his composure gradually returning. My daughter has a picture of your foundation's logo in her room, he said quietly. She calls it her guardian angel. All this time I never made the connection. He looked up, meeting Diane's eyes directly for the first time. I want to be part of this. I need to be part of this. Chief Thompson closed the folder. I think this is an excellent proposal, Ms. Walker. However, there still need to be formal consequences for what happened. I agree, Diane said. I'm not suggesting we pretend last night didn't happen. Officer Wilson and Officer Brooks should face appropriate disciplinary action. But firing them won't create change. It will just make two more officers who resent the system and the communities they're supposed to serve. The chief nodded thoughtfully. 2-week suspension without pay. Formal reprimands in their files. And upon their return, they'll be assigned to Ms. Walker's program, under her direct supervision. He looked at the officers. This is conditional on your full cooperation and commitment. One misstep and you're done. Is that clear? Both officers nodded solemnly. Ms. Walker, the chief continued, with your permission, I'd like to use the videos from last night in our department-wide training, with faces blurred, of course. But our officers need to see what these interactions look like from the outside. I think that's appropriate, Diane agreed. though the thought of becoming a training video example made her stomach clench. She turned to her brother. Thomas, I'd like your help getting city funding for the expanded program. Thomas, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, leaned forward. You'll have it, and the mayor's full support. He glanced at the officers with undisguised contempt. Though I still think these two got off easy. Diane placed a hand on her brother's arm. This isn't about punishment. It's about progress. The formal part of the hearing concluded shortly after, with paperwork signed and arrangements made for Diane to oversee the implementation of her expanded program. As the room began to clear, Wilson approached her hesitantly. Ms. Walker, he said, his voice still thick with emotion, tomorrow is the 3-year anniversary of Katie's remission. The foundation is hosting a celebration at Children's Hospital. We were invited as special guests. He swallowed hard. I don't deserve to be there, but Katie's been looking forward to it for months. She made a thank you card for the foundation. Diane felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of her wanted nothing to do with this man, wanted to keep her professional and personal lives separate from the trauma of the previous night. But another part remembered why she'd started the foundation in the first place, because healing happened through connection, not separation. Bring her, Diane said simply. This isn't about you or me. It's about Katie and all the other children the foundation supports. Wilson nodded, gratitude and shame battling for dominance in his expression. Thank you, he whispered. 6 months later, Diane stood at the podium in the Police Academy auditorium, looking out at the sea of faces before her. The expanded community engagement program had been implemented across 4 precincts, with plans to roll it out department-wide by the end of the year. The results were promising. Citizen complaints down by 23%, community trust ratings up, officers reporting higher job satisfaction. Real change doesn't happen overnight, she told the graduating class of new officers. It happens one interaction at a time, one person at a time. It happens when we choose to see the humanity in each other, even in difficult moments. Her gaze found Wilson in the back of the room. He wasn't in uniform today. He was here as a program volunteer, alongside other officers who'd been working in community centers and schools. The past 6 months hadn't been easy for him. Some officers had shunned him after the incident, calling him weak for breaking down. Others had defended his actions that night, which had been almost worse. But he'd shown up day after day at the community center in the same neighborhood where he'd pulled Diane over. He'd coached youth basketball, helped with homework, gotten to know the families who lived there. He'd listened to their stories of being stopped by police, of feeling targeted and afraid, of teaching their children what to do just in case. Brooks had taken a different path. After his suspension, he'd requested a transfer to the Community Liaison Office, where he now helped coordinate between officers and the neighborhoods they served. He'd thrown himself into learning about the history and challenges of different communities in the city, determined to unlearn the biases that had guided his actions that night. Today, I want to introduce someone special, Diane continued, gesturing to the side of the stage. Katie Wilson has something she'd like to share with you all. A 12-year-old girl bounded onto the stage, her energy and health a testament to her victory over leukemia. She took the microphone with confidence. 3 years ago, I was really sick, she said simply. The Bright Futures Foundation helped make me better. Now my dad helps with their programs. She beamed with pride. He says he's learning more from them than they're learning from him. He says Ms. Walker taught him the most important lesson of his life. In the back of the room, Wilson blinked back tears. The journey from that rainy night to this moment had been the most difficult and transformative of his career. He still carried the shame of his actions, but alongside it now was a determination to do better, to be better. Katie continued, My dad says sometimes you have to get things really wrong before you can start getting them right. He says police work isn't just about enforcing laws, it's about protecting people's dignity. Diane smiled at the young girl, then looked back out at the new officers. That's what we're really asking of you today. Not just to enforce the law, but to protect the dignity of every person you encounter, not just those who look like you or those who live in certain neighborhoods, or those whose names you recognize. Every single person. As the room erupted in applause, Diane caught Wilson's eye once more. He nodded to her, a gesture of respect and gratitude, but also of commitment. They both knew that one incident and 6 months of community work hadn't erased centuries of systemic problems. They knew that change was slow, that there would be setbacks and resistance, but they also knew that transformation was possible, that people could learn to see differently, to act differently, that systems could be reformed from within if enough people committed to the work. That dignity, once recognized, could not easily be denied again. As Diane stepped away from the podium, she thought about the night that had brought them all to this point. The rain, the humiliation, the fear, it would always be part of her story. But it wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, not just for her, but for Wilson, for the department, and for all the people they served who deserved nothing less than to be seen, truly seen for who they were.